would there be canonically a Jesus in the Darksiders universe? There has to be, right?
Well, if it's biblically accurate, sure.
When I look out my window, many sights to see. When I look in my window, so many different people to be, that it's strange, so strange. You got to pick up every stitch. You got to pick up every stitch. You got to pick up every stitch. Must be the season of the witch. Must be the season of the witch. Oh, must be the season of the witch.
So, here we are. It is I, Madhog, and I am joined by, I cannot believe it's not the bar, Dantan Stormkeeper.
Hello, it's me, Dantan Stormkeeper.
Are you? Are you really? Is it the Dantan? Wow, I cannot believe it.
Yes, last I checked my totally real date of birth and birth certificate, yes, it is me.
Yes, that's...
Totally botch that.
I mean, your name does sound like a character that could be in a Darksiders game, which happens to be the subject of tonight's episode, or podcast, or show. What a splendid segue.
Yeah.
I have a bit of an itch, and as always, when you have an itch, the healthy and normal thing to do would be to scratch it up until it starts bleeding. Right? Yes, that's totally what you should be doing. Take notes, kids. So,
Sure.
The end goal of this metaphor is to get you to understand that I decided to get me a copy of Darksiders 2 Definitive Edition for the PlayStation 4, of which I happened to find a physical copy second-hand, so I did not spend too much on it, and considering the amount of content I've gotten out of it, I cannot complain. You played the Darksiders games back in the day, didn't you?
Yes, all those years ago when they first came out, both the first and second one. I haven't played the third or the multiplayer one, the Genesis.
I guess that technically counts as a co-op game.
Yeah, it's because because it's 2-player, you play as War and Strife in that game, but that's more of a side game, prequel.
Right.
As you said originally before we started.
Yes, but let's not put our hands before us. Let's go in order. What even is Darksiders? No, I'm asking you.
Oh, you're asking me? Sorry.
Yes, I'm asking you. What even is Darksiders? Can you enlighten us?
It's based on the 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse and the idea that the apocalypse happens and all of humanity dies. And
So basically, Christian cosmology, the end of times, the Armageddon, and the 4 Horsemen, which aren't really part officially of the Christian canon. They're more of a folklore legend that was inserted into it because it sounds cool, I guess. I think there's a lot more to it. We don't have the time to get into that tonight, but there is a lot of lore and folklore, various iterations all throughout the centuries, much like the concept of the 7 deadly sins, which, depending on who you ask, might be even 8 or 6 or even more.
Yeah. Well, Vain Glory used to be one of them as well, but that's on a topic for another time.
I think that at some point the English language really messed it up and took Superbia and decided, no, that's just pride. I mean, if pride is sinful, then nobody should ever be happy about their lives, ever. Am I right, folks? Let's cancel pride. You hear that, the gays? Pride is cancelled. No, sorry, terrible joke.
But terrible jokes aside, back onto the Darksiders premise.
War, this guy, is summoned to Earth because he believes that the seals have been broken, which infers that the apocalypse is happening, and him and his brethren must ride to Earth to stop the forces of whatever the fuck from taking over the world and fucking up humanity. So he rides down, he's like, ready to kick some ass. But the angels are fighting demons, and they're like, why are you here? You're not meant to be here. The world, the seals weren't broken. The world isn't ending. So he's arrived. Everyone's kicking off because he shouldn't be there. You fight some demons, you fight some angels, you kill some angels, you get killed by a demon, and then the council's like, you should not have done what you have done. And he's like, but I was called. And he's like, they're like, you did not get called. No seals were broken. And he's like, but they literally were. And he's like, no, you must now be punished. And so they strip him his powers. And he has to then go on this like quest to stop whatever the fuck happened, figure out who called him if he was called, and also just kind of like, bring a little bit of balance back to the world.
The first game is you start off as war, basically when the apocalypse happens.
Yes.
The angels and demons are fighting, the humans are running in terror, and War is alone. Doesn't have basically the other horsemen with him.
Yeah, what happened there? That's weird. That's not supposed to happen. I thought there was always going to be 4. That's what the games tell me.
Well, what happens is that this is the very beginning of the game, so this isn't very much spoilers. War finds out that the apocalypse was started early, and everyone starts blaming him for it.
Yes.
And the Charred Council has him imprisoned for the crime of starting the apocalypse too early. And
you hate when that happens. Damn it, It's only Monday, guys. I can't start the apocalypse on Monday.
So War has to go off on a journey to clear his name, but with the Charred Council on his back, essentially, with a Watcher who is voiced by
Mark Hamill. Yes, I know that. The Mark, the Hamill, the Joker himself, Marky Mark. Yes.
Yeah, and as War, you go across a war-torn Earth after the apocalypse has happened for quite some time.
Quite some time. There are no humans left. Can you confirm that?
In the first 2 games, yes, but the third one...
The third one, I think that's a story for another podcast.
Yeah, I may not have played it, but I'm aware basically of the story overall. There are no humans, because they all died out, basically. They say that pretty much black and white in the first game. And War basically goes through meeting a bunch of characters of varying hostility, and he goes around kicking ass and chewing bubblegum, if he had any bubblegum left in the world.
Well, I guess he has a big sword, and he dresses like every Blizzard character ever made, so I guess he's got a lot of buttocks to beat.
The artist for this game is Joe, I'm sorry if I butchered this last name, Joe Madureira, who is often called Joe Mad, and he worked on not just Darksiders, but the Marvel comics, Uncanny X-Men, a Deadpool comic, and something called Battle Chasers.
Now that you said Battle Chasers, this explains everything. Literally everything has been explained. The pearly gates of knowledge have been opened in front of me. I have been hit by the light, and now I understand everything. Yes.
Well... his general style is taking Western comic influences, like mainly from artists like Arthur Adams, and he evolved it by using Japanese manga and video games as inspiration. So it wouldn't surprise me if Warhammer somehow came up in that.
Yes, I mean, I say Warhammer and also by extension Warcraft, and I would also add Diablo into that mix for a good measure. The designs and art direction in this game series is obeying the so-called rule of cool. in the sense that everything you see has an impeccable flavor to it. But it is also very openly derivative. I would say more so than one would find acceptable in some cases. For example, the angels in the games, the regalia and their presentation. If you have told me that they serve the Empire in Warhammer 40k, I would have believed you.
Yes, I would basically agree there, because of their general, basically, armors and
the aesthetic.
Style. There is something interesting about the designs of the demons and angels in the series, in which basically something that I only noticed basically recently, and it was only pointed out to me, the demons in the series, their wings are inverted, so they point up, whereas the angels, they all point down.
That's a nice bit of basic symbolism to notice. Speaking of the artist and the art direction of the series, I do generally find it fascinating. Like I said, it is extremely derivative. This is the kind of series that wears its many inspirations, many inspirations on the proverbial sleeve, but it also uses them as a solid foundation for the kind of world it wants to create and build, and that naturally also goes for the artistic influences. If you hadn't mentioned Battle Chasers in relation to this series, I would have mentioned Image Comics, Spawn, Jim Lee, 90s edgy comics in general. This series goes for a comic book hyperrealism in a time and place in which that practice was still being adopted in AAA video games, before that obnoxious obsession with photorealism eventually took over and everything became a lot more homogenized than it was already becoming by the time these games first came out.
The edgy gothic style, like a video game comic comes to life sort of thing.
Some of these characters, the way they are designed, including Death, would feel right at home in an issue of Cliffhanger. Remember Cliffhanger? There is also a battle between angels and demons, heaven and hell, in that comic book. So it's not a random reference, the one I just made.
I get what you're saying.
Can you imagine? I feel like Darksiders wants to be a comic book from the 90s in the best possible way. I'll be honest with you, back in the day, I would have just looked at this game and just scoffed in a very pretentious way, because honestly, there was this idea that we all had for some reason that the hyper-realistic comic book aesthetic from the 90s sort of killed and ruined the industry, which is an exaggerated sentiment, if you ask me.
Yeah.
There was this trend of cartoonishly muscular buff men and equally cartoonishly busty women. That warrants its own commentary, but for the sake of this particular game series and its particular aesthetic, I find it charming at this point, and that's because it's been 15 years since the first Darksiders game, if not more, actually. It's been the better part of 20 years at this point, and when you go back to it from the point of view of contemporary media and seeing how the AAA scene is a lot more homogenized and obsessed with photorealism, you go back to it and you witness this comic book hyperrealism, and it feels refreshing. It feels quaint yet refreshing to go back to it and to appreciate that at some point, regardless of actual quality, games in the highest levels were allowed to have an art direction, and they knew what they were and what they wanted to be. And I'm not saying they were better for it necessarily, but I will say that there was at least a level of creativity that seldom you see today outside of indies.
Yeah, I would say basically style, basically, at the time it was released, it wasn't appreciated for its style, basically.
Absolutely.
As much as other, and I think right now we're in this sort of, like, as you said, we're drowning in this basically humdrum, that everything's all the same.
We are right in the middle of a somewhat of an apocalypse, if you will, when it comes to video game as a career. And I'm not saying that just to be clever, that's pretty much what's happening.
Yeah, and we haven't even gotten past the 3rd month yet. That's basically mind-blowing to me.
Yes, it's been very bad. It's a bubble that has been inflated by the people at the very top, and those very people are blowing it up because everything is profit and humans are sacrificiable in this eternal war between the forces of... I'm not actually going to finish that sentence. I was trying to force an analogy with the plot of Darksiders, but it's not working, or rather, it's not worth it. This is a very serious thing.
Yeah, the basic outline of that is that it's a bunch of idiots at the top that just don't want to take responsibility and take all the money and chuck everyone else under the bus. That's basically it.
Yes, well, wait until we talk about who currently owns this IP.
Oh, yeah.
That's for later. Let's go back onto the track. So
yes, that's probably for best.
So we mentioned the current era of video games and our gripes with it, and everyone's gripes with it, let's face it.
Yeah.
But what about the time in which Darksiders came out? We are right in the middle of the so-called 7th generation console era, so to speak. So PlayStation 3, Xbox 360... The Nintendo Wii was selling gangbusters. Steam was getting started, if I recall. It is an era of video games that lives in infamy for many reasons, many of which I would say they were justified. The industry was shifting considerably since the days of the PlayStation 2. There was a much more consolidated scene in the AAA hemisphere, which means that we were slowly moving towards, again, games, high-budgeted games becoming more homogenized, longer production cycles, a lot of people getting overworked, the dream slowly vanishing, all of that. Also, it was a time in which video game discourse online was really starting to get a little out of hand. Some might say a bit toxic, racist, misogynistic even, prior Gamergate, and then the subsequent rise of fascism, but that's an essay for another time. And then, what else? What else about the 7th generation? All right! Call of Duty. Lots and lots and lots of Call of Duty still going strong today. One of the highest selling video game series of all time, the military propaganda machine in full force. I'm blaming Call of Duty and Activision Blizzard on most of everything that went wrong in the industry, but let's face it, they are more of a symptom than the cause.
That's true. They are more a symptom than the cause, as you said.
Right, right.
It's not just them. It's practices they've basically adopted from others. Maple Story sort of market.
Capitalism is a self-sustaining machine. You have to do this because your competitor is doing this, and you have to beat your competitor at any cost. Monopoly teaches us. An important makeup that defined the 7th generation was people suddenly deciding that Japanese video games are bad. And now the Western market is where real video games for the true hardcore gamers is to be found. It was the time in which JRPG was starting to be used as a pejorative term, if you recall.
Yeah.
It was also a time in which... Well, I'm not going to say that video game journalism is any better today. In fact, it's worse in many, many regards. But there was this idea, this really strange idea, that if a game is openly inspired by something else that exists, then it's not good, somehow. And that's where Darksiders was somewhat unjustly positioned. Just because it reminded people a bit too much of God of War, and too much of Legend of Zelda, and too much of several other things, that does not mean that the game is bad. That just means that the game is using some well-known templates and foundations in order to build itself. And I will say that the final building is... Well, it's not the best, most amazing building ever, but it's a building that stands out on its own 2 feet, and it's solid.
Because it goes with a stylized look, it's actually pretty good. timeless. It basically has a distinctive look about it. Even though it wears its basically inspirations on its sleeve, nothing is unique at all. Everything is derivative of something if you try hard enough to pick at it. So I think with what it's done, with basically its inspirations of Legend of Zelda, God of War, some Metroidvania.
If you get to the sequel, then you also have to add the Shadow of the Colossus and, weirdly enough, Left 4 Dead.
I would say like something like in the second one, World of Warcraft with the loot sort of thing.
No. I mean, in the sequel, there is literally an entire level that's just Left 4 Dead.
Right, yes.
You're shooting down hordes of the undead, including explodey ones.
Yes.
It's very funny that all of a sudden that game decides, you know what, enough with God of War and Legend of Zelda and all that, let's do a bit of Left 4 Dead, which, appropriately, feels a bit out of the left room.
Yeah, especially when the game's been basically conditioning you to do one thing for so long, and then suddenly, let's do something completely different.
And also, who could ever forget Portal puzzles? That's funny, because I cannot think of any other video game, aside from Portal and Portal 2, to ever use Portal puzzles, which I think is ridiculous, but that also might be the reason why so many critics called out Darksiders for being too derivative, because it doesn't bother reinventing the wheel too much. We are here to talk specifically about Darksiders 2. Definitive Edition in my case, Normal Edition in your case.
Yes.
By the way, speaking of Darksiders 1, I did not play Darksiders 1 myself, but I watched a streamer going through it. So I've experienced it vicariously for the most part, and I said to myself, this seems fun. I'm going to get the sequel and start from there. The story is actually not that complicated that you need a Bible to keep up with it. It's very simple and straightforward, all things considered.
Yeah, to say that they stuff in a lot of lore and characters, it somehow doesn't get too overly self-indulgent in itself. Is that the right word?
The voice acting and vocal performances, by the way, they are top-notch. In the sense that every spoken line of dialogue sounds like the most important information in the world, even though it's just a guy sending you on a fetch quest for the bajillionth time.
Yeah, some of my favourites are actually Vulgrim, the shopkeeper, and...
Vulgrim looks literally like a lich from Warcraft. Not even different.
I knew you were going to say that then, but yes, it is. He does like a lich from Warcraft 3, especially.
I'm not complaining. I like Vulgrim. I like him. This is what I meant by sometimes this game tends to be too derivative, too obvious. And that was a recurring, albeit moot criticism. I don't mind it, but it's just, I cannot not notice it.
Yeah, it probably gets worse when you think that basically Liam O'Brien voices War in the first game, and he voices Illidan in Warcraft 3, as well as other characters.
I'm going to say that War, specifically the character of War, he looks like Prince Arthas after he spent several years at the gym, and then he decided to put on all of his wardrobe all at once.
I was actually going to say that every time I played him, I always thought of Bruce Willis for some reason.
Really?
Yeah, I don't know why. It just makes me think of Bruce Willis, basically his general face or whatever, but that's just me.
When I hear his voice, I am War, the horseman, he sounds like a thespian on his dying breath. He's chewing the scenery every chance he gets, which I appreciate.
Yeah,
so,
War is basically not hammy, but he does chew the scenery whenever he's on.
He has a way of projecting his internal suffering. Let's go with that, which cracks through his facade of stoicism. There isn't much into these characters, if I'm being perfectly honest, but the vocal performances, really do a lot of heavy lifting. You know, much like in Castlevania Netflix.
Yeah, well, the general feel you're supposed to have with these characters. It's supposed to be a power fantasy, I feel, so
I mean, sure,
not
but
supposed to be, like, overcomplicated.
Well,
but
yes, but also death as an actual story arc all throughout the game, and I think we should actually get around to talk about Darksiders too.
There is a interesting thing about death, actually. There's a comic version of Darksiders. And
it doesn't surprise me in the slightest.
Yeah, well, the artist Joe, he basically wanted movies and
who wouldn't?
Yeah, and books and novels based on this IP because he loved it that much. His eyes are a different color. Like in the comic, his eyes are bluish green, but for some reason in the video games they're orangey red.
They must have considered what looks better on printed paper compared to your TV screen.
Yeah,
I'm assuming that's the case. What I like about Death as a design is that as soon as I laid my eyes upon him, I thought to myself, wow, he looks like Raziel after he spent a year at the gym in order to in order to fit his Spawn cosplay.
You're not the first to basically with that comparison. Even I basically was like, he looks a bit like Raziel, but I didn't actually think about basically the rest of him with the, going to the gym and everything. Like, he just got buffed to fit in a Spawn
Well, he's
cosplay.
very buff. He's a very buff Raziel. He's Raziel with
Yeah.
actual meat to his bones. And actually, this segues perfectly to what I want to talk about this particular game, and I guess by extension the rest of Darksiders, because everybody made their obligatory comparisons. Oh, this bit reminds me of God of War. This puzzle here seems right out of Portal or Legend of Zelda. Oh, look at this section later in the game when you fight the undead. That's Left 4 Dead. Oh, look at this one and only one boss fight that's basically a bad Shadow of the Colossus boss fight, which this game has, and I was annoyed at it, admittedly, but I am not interested in staying too much on those comparisons, which we've made already abundantly. Instead, I want to bring to the table another comparison, a more unexpected one, and that comparison is, as you might have guessed, Legacy of Kain. As I played through Darksiders 2, I couldn't help but being reminded of Soul River. And not just because the main character looks like Raziel, as we already established, but because it feels like I am playing a spiritual successor to Legacy of Kain. We have action sequences with a terrible lock-on system, which we'll get to later on. We have a lot of puzzles and backtracking, a rich setting with lore and history. We have a story about a main character struggling against his own fate. Is that starting to sound familiar to you?
Is that a question to me or the audience?
To you, I'm talking to you. And also the way that the narrative is structured, it seemed like I am playing a Legacy of Kain game, but with better action gameplay and less confusing puzzles.
I will agree the combat is pretty good, especially...
for the most part. There are some issues, but we'll get to those. And then I look at the structure, what was seemingly the structure of the entire Darksiders series. This is a story that stars the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And you know who they are. They are very famous. War, Death, Fury, Strife?
Yeah, have you ever heard of them?
No, first time. I guess they are the Forgotten Beatles or something. That confuses me a little bit, actually.
Yeah,
I don't know why they went with that.
Yeah, I don't know either, but that was something that's pointed out a lot by the fans.
It's my theory, my fun theory, if you will, is that they couldn't think of anything sexy for a character named Famine or Pestilence to do when it comes to combat gameplay. I guess they were not imaginative enough and they just defaulted to guy with gun and girl.
Guy with 2 guns.
Guy with 2 guns and girl with whip. Castlevania. Yeah. There is nothing wrong with that at a fundamental level, but it is weird and uncanny. But regardless, as I was saying, the general structure of the Darksiders games, every Horseman was going to have their own game. The apocalypse that wiped out humanity from the cosmic map will be the starting point of the series and also the starting point of every game. So war gets framed for a murder, a genocide I should say, that he did not commit. Let's see, and then the following games would show us what the other horsemen were doing right at this time. And also ideally, all of that should eventually come together into Darksiders Defiance, if you will, in which they all fight together and topple down the status quo that's preventing them from achieving their destiny, which is something that they choose for themselves. What really drives home my comparison with Legacy of Kain is the flavor of it, the panache, the pizzazz, the presentation, and the taste of these games. What really drives a series like Legacy of Kain isn't really its confusing plot, isn't really its mediocre combat. No, what really drives your engagement with a series like Legacy of Kain is the world, the setting, and how it is presented and portrayed to you, the flavor of it, the lived-in nature, and the signs of conflict and history that make the aesthetic of the world of Nosgoth. And that's the feeling I get from playing Darksiders 2 specifically, because we have a seemingly large world that you can explore at your leisure for the most part. It's not quite open world. It's, again, similarly to Legacy of Kain, you have mostly a linear path, but there will be backtracking, and sometimes you find secrets on the off-beaten path. The devil is in the detail here. Death doesn't just open a door when he sees it. He summons his spectral form to open the door for him, which is very extra, but I like it. He doesn't just open treasure chests like that lame-o Link does. No. He summons the spectral form again, which destroys the chest for him, and then you get the contents of it. And I never ever get tired of that really satisfying feeling of finding a chest after you toiled to uncover the secret and solving a puzzle in order to get it. You open it up, you destroy it, and the dopamine is really doing circles in my brain.
Yeah, I get it. The satisfaction for the reward of, the effect, basically, it's powerful. After you've toiled, as you said.
It is not just the reward itself, it is how the reward is given to you. Like I said, this is where flavor comes in. When it comes to flavor is next to identity, and if this game's identity is to be extravagant and over the top when it gets the chance to be, here's another example of a really, really cool set piece that captures my imagination. Later on in this game, you visit the Kingdom of the Dead, which I guess makes sense. I'm playing as Death, the embodiment thereof, and we get to I believe it's called the Serpentine Throne, or the Eternal Throne. Something along those lines is where the King of the Dead resides. The structure is this one giant stone face carried by a couple of snakes. Delectable.
Yeah. Because of the presentation.
There is a proper sense of accomplishment because the flavor really makes it worth it. Even if the game falls short on other categories such as narrative and pacing, especially pacing, we still have these very good moments that make it all worth it. I enjoy Death as a character, mostly because he seems to have an interesting arc. His personality is a bit subdued. he comes off as a man who has suffered a trauma and is bearing the guilt of actions he committed in the past and is bottling everything up, and that is eating him up on the inside, but he's also the kind of guy who would literally go on a fetch quest to resurrect humanity instead of going through therapy. Which is literally what the premise of this game is. He is driven by the single-minded goal of redeeming his brother War, which I find adorable, honestly, some legitimate brotherly love here. He goes on a quest to try desperately to defy fate and revive humanity. Does he succeed at it? Well, who knows, really?
Yeah, the ending for the game leaves his fate ambiguous.
It does, but then it doesn't. It's complicated, like my non-existent Facebook status. Right, so there isn't really that much to say about the plot of Darksiders 2, if I'm being perfectly honest. The plot is an excuse to have you drive from one place to the other to do fetch quests ad infinitum.
Yeah, what I would describe Darksiders 1 is that you get one hub world connected to several dungeons, a la Legend of Zelda style, whereas Darksiders 2 is more, you get several hub worlds with more dungeons added for more content.
Yes, I was shocked and surprised to find out that the first world, which is basically Norse mythology world, let's call it like that, was again only the first world. It wasn't a small place, and I thought this game would be 10, 20 hours long at best. I clocked out at 40 hours.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Honestly, it felt a lot longer than that. And that's, again, because of the pacing of it.
If I remember correctly, each world is like, hey, you need to go here, but oh, wait, you need 3 items first to get basically, and they're all like that, where you need to get 3 of something to advance. And sometimes
you do the same thing 3 times, rinse and repeat. It gets old. You go to Norse mythology world, the land of the makers. Very, very buff Asgardians.
Yeah, I would agree. They definitely give off Asgardian vibes.
The first guy I meet is, I would call him, I cannot believe this is not Odin. And also he has both his eyes, so he cannot be Odin by definition.
The only one I remember from that race is Ulfwine, I think he's called, the blacksmith.
Yes, the lady blacksmith. By the way, there are 4 female characters in this game. I like the fact that 2 of them are extra tall and buff and could crush me by looking at me. And the other 2 are classic Spawn characters. Let's call them like that. But yes, Darksiders 2 is considered, generally speaking, the pinnacle of the series. At least according to that one streamer that I watched that played Darksiders 1 and inspired me to go on this journey, so to speak. But the problem with the plot, and therefore the pacing in this game, is that there is not enough story to justify the length of the game. It is clear that Darksiders 2 suffers from a classic case of long games that don't need to be as long, but they are as long to justify the price of admission, which is a problem with AAA games that really started with the 7th generation.
Yeah.
As such, the plot of the game, to justify the length of the game, devolves into a series of obligatory fetch quests. Now, mind you, I am not referring to side quests here. The beauty of side content is that it is something you can tackle at your own time if you really enjoy the game, but you don't have to do it. If you want to focus on the main plot, then you can just go through that. And that, in a game like this, should not really have been longer than 30 hours at most. When the obligatory main campaign part of the game is filled with hideous fetch quests after fetch quests after fetch quests then the experience drags on and it becomes a bit more heavy on your shoulders. Because as much as I enjoy the gameplay loop of action sequence, long dungeon with clever little puzzles, after the 38th hour of doing action sequence and long dungeons with clever puzzles, it all starts to seem a bit tiresome, even if the game has a ton of variety with its puzzles. Not with the combat, but the puzzles are many and varied. Let me tell you about my favorite puzzle in the game. Ironically, or I should say appropriately, almost as if to prove my point, my favorite puzzle in the game was for side content. It was to get a hold to an optional chest. Because getting a hold of optional chests was my raison d'etre when it comes to playing this game. I mean, why would I do anything else? Oh, look, there is that one chest, but it's just outside my reach. I cannot get it because I don't have the right power-up. So now I have gotten the new power-up, Metroidvania style. Now I can get there and get the treasure. And I never know what I get in those treasures because I do believe that the contents are randomized.
I do not remember fully, but
I get the feeling you get a different item, a different armor or weapon every time, and that would also make sense. And I like that as a concept, especially since it doesn't have a predatory monetization attached to it.
Yeah.
It's like loot boxes, but good.
Yeah.
But anyway, my favorite puzzle. I was traversing the Kingdom of the Dead for the very first time, right?
Yeah.
I come across this statue with a lantern attached to it and a light pointing to a wall, and I couldn't quite reach it because it was behind a grate, but I made a mental note of it and I would check it out later. So I go past that whole area, that small passage, and then I immediately come across a small tower, which also happens to have a statue with a similar lantern at the top of it. So then I discover I can move the statue, I can move it around, and then the light hits something in the distance from the direction in which I came. So then I teleport back into that area, and I find I have access to that other aforementioned statue. So I turn that statue, which hits the other tower back then, and now all of a sudden I have access to 3 treasure chests. And I love this. I love this puzzle because I was not tutorialized for it. I managed to figure it out based on context clues. And this really was the peak of puzzle design when it comes to Darksiders 2. And also, this feels like a Legacy of Kain puzzle if I ever saw one. That's where Darksiders is at its best, in my opinion.
I think that, yeah, you're correct there. The puzzles are engaging, basically, as long as they're not, like, overdone or, like...
Yes, honestly, I was pretty tired of portal puzzles and laser puzzles and split into puzzles and all of that by the end of it because I've been doing that for 40 hours and the dungeons tend to be very long in this game.
Yeah.
But also, in classic AAA gaming fashion, they eventually ran out of money and time and the final few dungeons were much shorter and the final area was just one boss fight waiting for me. So the game really, at some point, feels like it's ending abruptly. And that's never a good feeling to leave on such a note.
Yeah, that is sad when you have that feeling.
That ties with my previous notes about the weird pacing that this game has and how the narrative tries to elongate itself to justify it, and it doesn't quite work. But the journey itself, the experience, was pretty memorable, and it did take me by surprise a couple of times. I mentioned already the sudden Left 4 Dead stage.
Yeah.
which was a nice change of pace, I will admit. It felt, again, out of nowhere, but it felt also like a nice change of pace from all the puzzling and dungeoneering and action combat-y. Now I'm just shooting things.
Yeah.
That's different.
Yeah, it's nice, basically, change of pace when you get those rare turning of the table, so to speak.
Yes, well, turn the table on you right now, because I want to discuss about the action, the combat gameplay more in depth. But in order to do so, I am going to switch gears here, and I'm going to share with you a clip, a particular fight that I had, because I think it will be illustrative of my many gripes with the combat and the control scheme. Let's do it. So, I'm currently holding my PlayStation 4 controller in my hands. Here it is, here's our boy, Buff Raziel. I'm going to showcase this fight. It's a fight against an optional super boss known as the Deposed King. There you see him, encased in ice. This was a very, very hard boss fight, made worse by the fact that I was level 15 and this was a level 20 boss apparently. And yes, by the way, this game has RPG elements, in case I forgot to mention. You can see how little damage I'm doing. So you might have noticed that I have locked on to the giant, right? And I have to keep the button pressed manually. It's not a toggle option. The camera is not put strictly behind the character, it's on the side, which makes it a bit more difficult to gauge the distance between the character and the hitbox. Or I should say the hits coming from the boss. And that also makes dodging a bit more difficult. And I have to be especially wary about the timing here, because this is basically a one-hit kill affair. If I get hit by that mace of ice once, it's game over. Now, this is the kind of game that uses every single button on the controller. To activate a special magic move, I have to press L1 and one of the main input buttons, square, triangle, circle or X. But in order to use that, I have to let go of L2, which is the button I'm using for the lock-on. And that button does not toggle, so I have to keep it pressed. But I have to let it go if I want to use a special move. So that already is nonsense. And I cannot rely on the camera, because it's very unreliable. But speaking of unreliable, sometimes the lock-on button is completely unreliable, such as engaging the distance between you and the enemy. Sometimes this boss specifically does a tornado attack, and that's when I let go of the lock-on in order to run to the other side of the room, like now, and I need to look where I'm running in order to see how much distance I can put between me and the boss. But that also leads to this awkward situation in which the guy just corners me and I have to finagle my way out of it. And I have to keep doing this up until I somehow win. Now, this is my 20th attempt at beating this boss. I think this also illustrates why it was so difficult to do this, because I have to wrestle with these very specific controls that cannot be remapped. The fact that I have to keep pressing the lock-on button and then use my remaining fingers to do everything else in a kind of action gameplay that requires me to use basically every single button. This happens when I get hit by the mace. I could die in an instant. Nevertheless, you can see why my fingers would start hurting me. Because I have to play it in a very specific manner. And this just makes me think about the old God of War games. In the old God of War games, you did not need a lock-on button, because the camera was positioned in such a way that you could see every enemy surrounding you. But that's not really the case in this game. This is the kind of game that has you fight like in God of War, but with a significantly worse camera, and the lock-on button exists to try and make it easier on you, but it's not always reliable. But anyway, here's me beating the deposed king after a long, grueling battle. And here's my reward, which is a mace I cannot use because it's level 20, and access to higher gear is walled up to me because I am too low level. So it's a mace I never end up using. And here I am, victorious, buff Raziel. And this was by far the hardest fight in the game. I felt good. I felt good after beating it, but also my hands hurt. And I feel like this could have been a lot easier if I could just toggle the lock-on button. It is such a simple yet game-altering difference in that sense. There you have it. Thoughts?
Well, because of my memory, basically, I've not played this game in like 12 years or something like that. I do basically remember at times the lock-on could be a bit finicky.
It is
and
problematic. Yeah, that lock-on button is getting cancelled, let me tell you.
I vaguely do remember that. And some bosses could be harder than others, but I remember...
The biggest threat to you would be the unreliable camera controls, which would not be fast enough to keep track of the movement of your enemies, and the angle does not help, which is why the lock-on button would exist, but the lock-on button really goes against you when you're fighting multiple enemies, and also it could be an issue when you're trying to time your dodge roll, because it's, as I said, harder to gauge the distance between you and your enemy.
Yeah. I do get that, especially from after seeing the footage that you showed here.
Yes, like I said, it's complete nonsense. I have to let go of the lock button because I need to use my finger to press another button in order to activate the special move, and I cannot do otherwise. I cannot use my other fingers to push on the lock-on button because otherwise I would have no grip whatsoever on the controller. This is a fundamental design flaw that I don't miss from this era of video games, I will admit. I've gotten used to it eventually, but again, after a time, this will hurt your fingers, inevitably.
Yeah, I do remember basically some other reviewers saying some similar sentiments about the lock-on, especially the controls with like saying that you need like a third finger stapled onto your hand to hold the button down.
Precisely.
It's definitely flawed, and if it was ever remastered, it would definitely need tweaking in that respect.
Well, this has already been remastered, in fact. I played the PlayStation 4 version, the Definitive Edition, and they still did... Yes, like I said this at the beginning of this whole thing, and they yet did not add a toggle option to it. The sequel, Darksiders 3... which is the Dark Souls game. I'm gesticulating as I say that.
Yeah.
That one finally added the revolutionary game mechanic of a toggle option for your lock-on button. So much better. That's my biggest issue with the action gameplay. It's getting repetitive after a while, and having to constantly fight against the basic design choices of your game, which cannot be remapped or modified in any way whatsoever. That can be detrimental to one's experience, or indeed one's limbs.
Yeah. The combat for me, from what I remember, was enjoyable for the most part.
It is.
Flawed.
It was. It's nice, fast, crunchy, violent. You can buy combos and add it to your arsenal. You can do light weapon, heavy weapon. I love the customization options. I love that you can get rare possessed weapons that you can upgrade by feeding it other weapons and inherit their traits. I love how you can build your character to be strong at fighting or strong at magic. I love the variety and customization. This, of all the games in the series, this is the one that feels the most like a properly developed RPG.
Yeah, I like it that everyone can have their own version of Death, but I also like that Death himself is designed around being primal and like a force of nature, and it comes across in the sound design and the aesthetics, as well as the way he just generally moves around, like the way he's animated with all of his different weapons and magics.
Yes, I have mixed feelings about the way in which you traverse the game's world. Specifically, this game is right in the middle of that uncharted renaissance of prompt-based platforming and ledges, in that you can only grab onto very specific ledges and very specific hotspots, which in a way it's a bit lame to not be able to have your freedom. But on the other hand, it is somewhat comforting to know that you have only a set amount of directions and a set amount of hotspots in the world that you can interact with, which means you won't run the risk of soft locking yourself in some dumb way like a speedrunner.
Yeah.
So, but yes, you can do a lot of Prince of Persia-ing in this game. Wall running, ledge jumping to other ledge grabbing, and then you get the power-ups that will improve your interface with the world. I do believe that this was the game that the developers really wanted to make, with the kind of size and the kind of abilities and anything you could do in it. This is the pinnacle when it comes to the ambition of the series. If you are nostalgic for this era of gaming, this is a solid gem. And if you want a sprawling RPG experience with plenty of puzzles, Zelda-style dungeons, and if you want to be reminded of Legacy of Kain on some level, you have to be wary of its flaws, though, which are many and they are annoying.
I would say it's a flawed gem, and I would say Darksiders 1 is also in that camp. They're not brilliant games, but they are fun though.
They have thought behind them. They have an art direction. They have solid foundations. They don't build too outside of their comfort zone, but they do have memorable moments. I enjoy the world, I enjoy some of the characters, I enjoy the performances, which really drive the plot, however light and uninteresting it might be. When it comes to the characterization in Darksiders, its main characters, they are goal-oriented characters, and I'm not just saying that because they are video games, with a sort of arc loosely attached to them, which only comes to play in very specific times. For example, Death is motivated by saving war, by restoring humanity. What a weird sentence to say, come to think of it.
Yeah, I was going to say Death is like presented in a very weird, like friend of humanity sort of way, basically, that he's looking to save humanity by redeeming war as well as saving the souls of humanity.
But that makes sense if you consider his backstory.
Yes.
So something that's said at the beginning of every Darksiders game is essentially the recap of the history of the series, is that there once was a race of angel demon offsprings known as the Nephilim. They did not have a place in the universe, so they tried to carve one for themselves, and this caused untold violence and war. And they were about to invade the Garden of Eden, but then 4 of the Nephilim betrayed them. Those 4 would eventually become the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, and the only 4 surviving Nephilim because they genocided everyone else in order to save the balance and serve the Charred Council, which, let's face it, they are the big bad. It's obvious that the direction this series is taking, the falsehoods of a status quo balance that only benefits those at the very top, and essentially a genocide was committed in the name of peace. And boy, that's perennially topical, isn't it?
Yep, sure is.
But anyway, so the Nephilim, Death was the one who felt the most guilty about it. And he carries that burden with him, literally, because he has the souls of all the dead Nephilim stuck, encased in his heart. The conflict that drives the story of the game is mostly internal, because, well, there is an outside opposition to Death. Corruption, that is, which was a former brother of Death, a former Nephilim who survived technically, but became literal corruption that wants to destroy all of existence because of grief and rage. But that ties in with the internal conflict that Death is having. Will he save humanity, or will he restore the Nephilim to appease his guilt? This is a story about guilt, about trauma, about moving on. And once again, it did not need to be 40 hours long. If it was a bit shorter, maybe we could have had a bit more of a characterization for Death, and a lot less in terms of fetch quests that distract you. It's still a fun game to play, and I still would recommend it to get it second hand, half-priced, a physical copy.
Yeah.
This is another series, yet another franchise, that has felt the embrace of Death, figuratively and literally, because these games were developed by Vigil Games, and we should have probably led with that, actually. Better late than never, I suppose. They were published originally by the company known as Nordic Games. Later on, they would rebrand themselves as THQ Nordic Games, after taking the dead brand of that other company known as THQ, the WWE Wrestling Games company.
Yep.
But then that also became one of the many companies bought by the Embracer Group. So now they have started the video game apocalypse.
Funny enough that you kept saying basically Legacy Kid, right? They also have Legacy Kid.
They do. What don't they have?
Right?
That's
They
the
have all that
part.
IP and they're literally squandering it all.
It's all about recouping the money so that they can look good when the financial quarter is up. But yes, we do live in an age when if you want to find the same level of variety and creativity you used to find in your PlayStation 2 library with your hidden gems and interesting but horribly flawed titles, you have to look at the indies. Darksiders 2 feels like I'm diving into the past to play perfectly fine games that don't suck ass. And here we are, at last, at long last, us discussing a game that we both enjoyed in this poorly structured, poorly paced podcast, which, hey, seems appropriate.
Yes, I quite agree. Even though basically we fans of games and whatnot, and we waffle on, and our thoughts just dribble out like badly paced set of puzzles. Basically, that stops us from getting to the main point of why we're getting there.
Yes, I mean, here's the deal. Before we get to the next point, we have to collect 3 other points into 3 different areas, bring them together, and then we can advance the point we were trying to make.
Yeah.
Right.
But I will say that I am basically more of a Darksiders 1 fan myself, personally. I do like Darksiders 2 as well. I like Death. I like his story. But for some reason, Darksiders 1 I remember a lot more of fondly. I think the pacing was a lot better as well. The puzzles didn't overstay their welcome like they do in the second one. But there's nothing wrong with the second one. The second one is still good.
Yes, the second one really speaks to me as the kind of sequel that came after a very successful first entry in the franchise. So it gets to have everything that they could not include in the first game to a fault.
Yeah.
And then the third one seems like a return to a more restrained, more structured opus, because perhaps the sequel was not as successful as the first one. I am not sure, I don't have the data before me, but methinks that I want to keep the gravy train rolling, I want to keep the 4 horsemen carriage carrying, I guess, and I want to discuss Darksiders 3 as well.
Okie
Because I'm playing it, so why not?
Yeah. I haven't played that one, sadly, but I should do.
Well, it's okay. No, that's it. I don't have anything else. I thought I was going to say something else, but no. And with that, I believe we can safely conclude this very long podcast. Let's face it.
Well, we are talking about Darksiders too. Yeah.
Right then.
But in the words of Samael, sometimes the hero dies in the end.
I will not eat green eggs and ham. I will not do it on a boat with a goat. I will not eat green head and ham, Samael.
Nice Johnny Bravo reference.
What are you talking about? It's a Dr. Seuss reference. Good night, everybody. Can you imagine Darksiders if it was a 90s property? Can you imagine the comics? They would probably be published by Image. They would be drawn by Todd McFarlane exactly once and then never again. They would be super edgy and violent and brutal and sell a lot of toys to kids, inexplicably. And then we get to the animated series, which is exclusively for children, like the Mortal Kombat one. I have the opening credits for you, right here, right now. War, death, guns, girl. These are the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, tasked by the Charred Council to protect humanity and maintain the balance of the cosmos. But betrayal happens at the House of War, and he was accused of a crime he did not commit. And now, all the horsemen have to band together and fight against a conspiracy that consumes the entire cosmos. This is their story. This is Darksiders. Darksiders, warriors of justice coming for you. Darksiders. And then there is the crossover episode with Skeleton Warriors. Darksiders. Sang to the tune of Darkstalkers.
And now I'm just thinking of Scooby-Doo Mysteries with all the guest stars, and then basically, it's Scooby-Doo and the 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse!
Well, gee, gang, it's the 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse. What are you doing here in Asgard? Well, gang, it looks like we have a mystery on our hands. Let's find out. Let's find out who Mark Hamill is or something. I don't know. I'm going to end it here. Jesus. Would there be canonically a Jesus in the Darksiders universe? There has to be, right?
Well, if it's biblically accurate, sure.
Biblically accurate Jesus removes the mask. Old Man Jenkins? Okay, enough with that.
Okay.